All right, welcome to this conversation on optimization in healthcare analytics. So let's go through some of our stacking of terms that we keep putting together. We started by talking about overall health system modeling. Okay, so this is creating a simplified representation of how the system works, so that we can reason about it and start measuring possible futures. We're measuring possible futures with simulation, running that representation forward in time, many times over, to see the range of possible behaviors. Now we're going to move on to the next concept of what we might do, which is optimization, using mathematical methods to find the best decision, specific decision, allocation, configuration, whatever the case may be, subject to the constraints and performance goals that we have. So it's two different ways to use the system model. In simulation, we're doing the what happens if we do X type of questions. And in optimization, we're answering something more like, what should we do? What should we set this variable to? How much of this can we allow? So on and so forth. Reminder, we're working towards this better definition of advanced analytics in healthcare, which is when we can achieve the repeated translation of raw data into trusted insights and operational change. Because we work in a complex adaptive system in healthcare, what we actually are going to be driving to do is to model towards first principles variation of our problem so that we can explain behavior, not just predict a specific single outcome, and use the model to reveal leverage points. If we were to just focus on predicting a specific outcome, as many do early on in problem solving with analytics, we're going to go to the OR and predict things like case length or cancellation rate. In the ED, we'd predict likelihood of admit or surge predictions, predict demand in the transfer center, census in the hospital, or disposition. Instead, we're moving towards driving the institution's ability to anticipate and act on the levers that matter by using optimization as a technique. So this is where we're looking for predicting something like the likelihood of PACU boarding so we can make a choice about how to adjust the schedule. And that's a little bit of what we're actually going to look at in this optimization example. Or predicting likelihood of ED boarding for the purpose of adjusting staffing. We still may predict census, but in order to make a decision in diversion or where to focus effort for discharge, adjust schedules, or prioritize cleaning activity within the hospital. So we're moving on from the prediction idea into systems thinking. And we're still working on this real world example of the PACU to keep a little bit of continuity here. So we're avoiding this situation where we get all excited about the math of being able to predict a single outcome, even if it is accurate, because we don't want to find ourselves in meetings like this, where everybody is frustrated and confused why such smart people came together and didn't get to a good result. Because instead we want a meeting like this where we can move on to the next high quality questions, right? What staffing patterns might minimize this? Which OR blocks can we put in place? Which proposed expansions are going to work? Moving on to questions like that. We're still within this framework that we've seen now a couple of times, that we start by defining the units that matter to our problem. We map the flow of patients, add constraints so that we have some reality infused. We characterize variation with distributions. We simulate scenarios to measure likelihood of different endpoints. And finally, we're ready to design a decision support, something to make a good decision within this system. So this is the view you've seen where we decompose the flow of patients and measure variation within it so that we've got that infused. But now we're going to move on. We did that and we did a bit of light simulation. But why isn't simulation enough? Because simulation is going to give us the what happens if we do X, okay? Very meaningful and useful for planning and probing different questions about how the system will react. But we're moving on to what should we do, okay? So simulation can reveal distributions of possible PACU occupancy, risk of hitting capacity, variability across the days, how delays propagate out through different sections. But it doesn't choose the best action. We need to set our problem up into an optimization to do something like that. So I'm going to change the question on you a little bit. We're going to ask a question that's more like this. For a given surgical day, how many elective cases can we safely schedule while keeping the PACU congestion risk below some acceptable threshold? Okay, so this helps to give us a view of how the OR and PACU flow to interact across a day. We have some constraints put into place because we only have so many places to put patients, and we want to understand the possibility of different scenarios and how they could play out. But we need to know the probability of congestion under these constraints in order to make a good decision. These are the constraints we put in place: is a capacity of three bays. We've decided urgent cases must run regardless of load. Case distributions and PACU length of stay vary according to a distribution similar to history, and that arrival patterns are uncertain. Those are the constraints we've got in place. We also prefer to avoid late day OR bumps and desire to minimize cascading delays. So if we were digging into the math and how to accomplish every last piece of this, we would start moving down, defining what exactly is it that we're maximizing or minimizing in this. And so we are going to look to maximize the number of elective cases that we can run, subject to the probability of our PACU being full, given those cases, being less than a risk threshold that we have. We're going to go ahead and just choose a risk threshold that seems operationally relevant here. Example, 25%. So we're looking to minimize the risk of PACU congestion, but maximize elective surgical volume. Very common type of problem that needs to be solved for. So we need to know flow, variation, and wait times. They interact. We know they're pretty messy, which can have this issue of, the identical caseload can produce really different results. So we can observe, though, the typical variation from all these key elements and simulate out into history, out into the future, what the probable futures are in order to choose and do this next thing. So what we're going to do is choose a candidate elective case count arbitrarily. We will simulate the surgical day many times with that choice, and then estimate the probability that the PACU hits capacity under that elective case count. So you remember that we had, an example historical occupancy view of a day where we had cases on the 9th, okay? And we had 6 cases, 5 were elective, and 1 was urgent on this day. So we had a mix there, and we have some view of what happened with patients getting through that system. Gives us this sort of realistic pressure point to work against, to try to optimize given what we have in our system. We also did some basic simulation to say, with that schedule, how often are we at different capacities for the PACU, and how often is our time over capacity, within what range. So you saw this from last time. Here's where we move on to with this approach. We go ahead and we keep everything else constant, but we vary the elective load. We're going to move between 1 and 8 cases, and we'll go ahead and run that scenario over and over again. 1 case, and then sample randomly from the variation within our system, and see how many of those simulations end up above our capacity of 3 patients. So we are looking to find out what elective caseload is safe, and we wanted to keep under that 25% threshold. So, in the background, what you're seeing is an example of what we would get out. We would get this curve that shows for the different elective case volumes from 2 to 14, what is our exactly proportion of simulations that end up above the threshold. And so you're seeing at 2 cases and 3 cases, we're at a very low probability of going over our capacity. And that dotted line is where 25% is. So once we move up to 4 elective cases, we have a probability of being over capacity that's just above our threshold. So this is where we can actually arrive on a decision. If we're being strict about that threshold, the answer is 3. We can, schedule 3 cases, and we believe only 25% of the time in the future will we hit capacity, or exceed capacity. But results like this help us think about whether or not the 25% threshold is meaningful, or if it's safe to bump that elective caseload up to 4 and accept a threshold likelihood of hitting capacity that's higher than 25%. So this is where we take simulation and we can actually get to an answer, right? You've got that constraint, all these constraints in place. We've got an objective that we want to maximize to. And so we can get to an answer of what is the optimal elective caseload that keeps our likelihood of exceeding capacity underneath this threshold. So this is a real decision that you can get to through advanced analytics. So I mentioned before that there's probably more than one point on this curve that's interesting to evaluate too in these results. So in summary to this whole topic, predictions don't just naturally mean you can make a decision. We move on through other types of modeling like simulation modeling to reveal some of the behaviors within our system. And when necessary, we can use optimization to formalize the trade-offs that we might have to make within a decision. So we can use data and modeling to answer real operational questions instead of just give some flimsy guidance or general direction. This is really important to use a framework that can help us to apply this because it means we can be useful on setting policies, blocking schedules, making staffing adjustments, making real decisions within healthcare. So thanks for sticking with me through this modeling topic. The next video is going to be walking through the code where we accomplish this, and you can see how we do this in a tool like Python.